Okay, actually, we're going to start with Katie. I just want to say that the article, we did not come up with the title. The title is drawn from Keats. So what we're going to do is Katie's going to sort of introduce Keats and maybe what he would have to say about education as soul-making. I'm going to offer some criticisms of that, and then John is going to offer criticisms of both of us. So it's basically, don't expect coherence among us. In point of fact, we actually have lots of agreement. We had a really enjoyable conversation trying to decide what we were going to do for today. But in any case, it's going to, I sort of set it up as she's the good cop, I'm the bad cop, and then he's the FBI that comes in and just sweeps us aside. Or he's a really bad cop. So that's how we're going to do it. So. There is a handout. I only made 15 copies, so if you see somebody who doesn't have it, you can sort of like, you know, let them look over your shoulder.
And you criticize John.
And then all of you can criticize John.
We're trying to like a healthy amount of discussion.
Yeah, we're hoping to have good discussion. Thank you. Katie.
I'm Katie Carlson. I teach English. The only thing I need to say before I actually get started is that I did include one long quotation from the article, so I'll read it to you. It's also on your handout. I just wanted that available for you in case you didn't get a chance to read the article, so that there's some consensus about what it is we're actually talking about. Okay. In his apologetic preface to Endymion, John Keats stated, quote, "The imagination of a boy is healthy, and the mature imagination of a man is healthy. But there is a space of life between, in which the soul is in a ferment, the character undecided, the way of life uncertain, the ambition thick-sighted. Thence proceeds mawkishness and all the thousands of bitters whose men I speak of must necessarily taste in going over the following pages." The psychological category of adolescence would not be defined for another 75 years, but Keats handily both identified and embodied late adolescent angst in the prelude to his poem. If you don't recognize the title of Endymion, you will likely recognize the opening proclamation, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." With a tagline that memorable, Keats had nothing for which to apologize. Yet our purpose today is not to revel in poetry. Rather, it is to address what Keats can tell us about students themselves, those creatures whose souls are in a ferment because they are, in fact, the same age as the poet of Endymion. When Carolyn Dirksen and Aaron Johnson invited me to help discuss an article formulated around John Keats's definition of vocation, my enthusiasm swelled. After all, students in the Vest Building frequently refer to Keats as Dr. Carlson's boyfriend. Yet the Bobby Fong piece central to our conversation today does not concern Keats's poetry or biography, but rather one of Keats's inimitable letters, namely the one in which he coins his phrase, "the veil of soul." This letter was written a few years later than Endymion, during what would have been Keats's senior year if a stint at Lee had been available to him. Fong's summary of Keats's term requires no explication, so I'll quote it at length. This is Fong. Keats proceeds in the letter to describe the development of the soul as the interaction of three materials: the intelligence, the human heart, and the world or elemental space, suited for the proper action of the mind and heart on each other for the purpose of forming the soul. The world is the staging area, what Keats calls the veil of soul-making. The intelligence refers to the mind, the capacity for apprehension and analysis with which humans are born. But it is the heart that Keats describes as the mediator between the mind and the world, and thus the conduit to soul-making. We begin as undifferentiated minds, intelligences without individual identities. But we are capable of learning, and in our ability to apprehend and create knowledge, our eyes are open, and we can become as gods. We are schooled in the world, a world of circumstance and contingency that the mind struggles to apprehend. It is not the learnings of the mind that make the individual, however. The wisdom of the soul is knowledge of the world, filtered through the medium of the heart. And it is a particular aspect of the world to which the heart must respond. The circumstances of a world in pains and troubles, a place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways. In the Veil of Soul-Making letter, Keats is advocating the heart over the intellect alone, but not in a touchy-feely or dismissive way. And certainly, I must make this absolutely clear, Keats was not devaluing private reflection or the life of the mind. After all, the aesthetic philosophy of this introverted genius is among the treasures of intellectual history. In defining the veil of soul-making, Keats contends that mere enlightenment reasoning, what James K. A. Smith would call brains on a stick, does not the telos of a distinct character make. His point is not unlike our notion that Christian higher educators should equip the whole person, heart and mind, body and spirit. Yet the outcome in Keats's eyes will not be a singular ideal Übermensch, but many wildly different souls. Under this definition, teaching just the intellect produces conformity, while true uniqueness, creativity, and vocation come from the individuation that results when a heart links the intellect to the refining fire of the world. Unlike many of the 20-somethings we know, but not all, Keats was deeply familiar with the varieties of human suffering. This young man lost his brother to tuberculosis the year he wrote the Veil of Soul-Making letter. His mother had died of the same disease a few years earlier, and given his training as a surgeon, he could see his own impending death. 2 years later, Keats did die, penniless and barely known, leaving behind a sweetheart he longed to marry and ungleaned potential at which we can only guess. For Keats, as for Christianity, suffering was developmental as it was real. But there's one thing about the Veil of Soul-Making letter that Bobby Fong's article does not address. Keats framed his veil in opposition to the old Christian tradition that earthly existence is a veil of tears, a sense that life is merely something to be endured in the hope of heaven. Keats wanted to reclaim the value of existential experience, a value that he felt Christianity denied. Yet while Keats's critique of our faith limits his ability to speak to the integration of Christianity and learning, I might be so bold as to say that he was attacking a straw man Christianity that actually looks more like Gnosticism. If he'd written his Veil of Soul-Making letter for a grade in my class, I might challenge him on that point, but then I'd just sit back and listen. For goodness sakes, I'd sit back and listen. I want to say that Keats might show up in my office hours or in yours, but the truth is that there will never be another Keats. The Veil of Soul-Making wouldn't allow it. There will, however, be other great souls made. So how can we seek to soul-make our students while recognizing that individuals who walk across the graduation stage will not only vary, but should vary, and widely? How can we expose these souls to human suffering without crushing their spirits? And how can we eschew anti-intellectualism and ignorant knee-jerk action while recognizing the value of a broader, more holistic sense of collegiate development? In these questions, Keats can perhaps represent both our students and serve as our teacher.
Thank you. To say something positive first, I agree with Fong's reading of Keats that teaching ought to be about soul-making, insofar as it is an emphasis on a more holistic approach. And of course, as soon as I say holistic, this is a buzzword, you all feel good, I just said something positive about education. This is of course we don't want compartmentalization, of course we want integration, etc. And that's basically what he's pushing for, integration of heart and mind, less attention to the space in which that goes on, which is going to come out a bit in some of my thoughts. Ultimately, though, for me, the primary problem for Fong, following Keats, is that he presumes an individualistic model of education, that soul-making is the project of helping students be their own person. Inherent in such an approach to teaching is a fundamental relativism and a notion that students, as humans, are generally good. I obviously have different experiences because I'm about to go in a different direction with students being generally good. But what if human goodness, not just student goodness, but what if human goodness is ever distorted in pervasive ways? I.e., what if we have a healthy view of sin nature? And I remind my students of this when I tell them I'll be looking for cheaters in exams. What if our healthy respect for diversity nonetheless has concluded that there might best be at least some limits to our relativism? What if we are not so sure that teaching is merely about a student's individual personal quest to be their own soul? What if education is about more than giving students a wider array of options to choose from before they go off and become their own person? Indeed, an individualist model is not only unhealthy, it is misleading. It is unhealthy because it presumes that the most important thing a student can do is for themselves, rather than for others. That a liberal arts education liberates a self for the sake, first and foremost, of itself, rather than for the sake of others. At least for Christian teachers, we must wonder whether we should be wary of too quickly forgetting our fundamental commitment to following Christ's self-emptying model. The individualistic model is misleading, so it's unhealthy for those reasons. It's misleading because nobody truly marches to a beat of a different drummer. Those claiming to be different or nonconformist are following in a long and rich tradition of individualism and nonconformity. I found that this was a very sad moment when I grew up in the punk rock subculture where you wanted to be a nonconformist, and then a band named Pennywise made fun of how all the nonconformists are really conforming to nonconformity. It's a really big burst to a person's bubble at a young age. When I was thick-sided and mawkish. And education has never performed such feats of self-realization. In spite of protestations to the contrary, teachers do not really want students to think for themselves. I came from an institution that told me my highest job as a teacher is to help students think for themselves. But I don't think that that's really what we're doing. I think we're practicing self-deception when we say that. And I think the Robin Williams character in Dead Poets Society was doing the same thing when he had his students rip out the introduction to their poetry book. You need to approach poetry for yourself, think for yourselves. And all the while, of course, they're learning to think more like him while being told they're their own individuals. I don't think we want students to think for themselves, but to think well. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we all have a host of assumptions about what we take to be intellectual virtues and vices, such as clarity versus sloppiness, attentiveness versus impatience, integration, to use a buzzword that's on campus right now, versus compartmentalization, humility versus arrogance, stinginess, intellectual stinginess versus generosity. What Fong and Keats are right about is that education is about soul-making, at least if we understand a soul to be a student's whole person. As Jamie Smith, a Reformed Pentecostal philosopher that Katie's already alluded to, has persuasively argued in a book that I put as required reading on your handout, the university is comprised of a cluster of embedded liturgies or rhythms of activity that exhibit what we love. Even so-called secular universities are formed by such liturgies. Souls are liturgical creatures. I take such an observation to involve two things. First, the recognitions that humans are by nature formed by rhythms of body and mind. Indeed, God made the rhythms of morning and evening before he even created humanity. Second, the recognition of some of our most mundane activities and patterns of life are never neutral, i.e. there is no such thing as a truly secular education. They are contributing to habits, both of mind and of body, and habits lead to dispositions, and dispositions to character of a particular kind. To give some concrete examples here at Lee, because I've mentioned liturgies before, I've talked about Jamie Smith before, but to give some concrete examples, especially if you don't like the word liturgy. First, the simple introduction of free meal tickets for faculty who avoided parking on campus did more than merely introduce a few more minutes of walking into our sedentary lives, which I think walking is a valuable liturgy, by the way. The importance of the liturgy of professors and students eating in communion, or at least in general proximity, because I sometimes am trying to have communion with a book when I go to the cafeteria. Nonetheless, its importance should not be lost on us. And you can just think about what goes on if you go over and have a meal every day over in the cafeteria and just unplanned engagements that go on. A second example, the sometimes frenzied liturgies of, I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, but given who I am, the sometimes frenzied liturgies of cheering athletes on by a mix of students and faculty has drawn my own awareness to the significance of my presence in the stands, to the interaction between myself and students in the classroom. We see another side to each other in our unguarded moments. Unfortunately, students have seen my unguarded moments in regards to referee calls. While the apathetic or academically uninvolved student sees me as less distant and I them, I can personally attest to this. I gain a greater, and likewise, I gain a greater appreciation for God's good creation of souls integrally breathed into bodies. I think it's part of our education. A third concrete example. The liturgy of formal worship together in chapel is crucial. Our lectures do not inhabit a different universe then the songs, commotion, whispering, texting, hand-holding, hand-raising, distractions, and desires that are displayed and performed in chapel services, whether at the Conn Center, which many of us complain about, the Dixon Center, or the Stone Chapel venues. We may wish it to be otherwise, but our grudging avoidance makes it no less powerful in our students' lives. While, on the other hand, our committed engagement may lead to healthy shifts and reformulations of these liturgies. That's the end of my concrete examples. The questions we must grapple with, and I'm just going to leave a bunch of questions that sort of parallel some of the questions on your handout, but they're different. The questions we must grapple with are, what liturgies are currently shaping our lives? What rhythms? What liturgies are shaping the lives of our students? How can we identify those liturgies that contradict the liturgies that direct us towards our true vocation of service to God and others? How can faculty more intentionally involve themselves in the task of rerouting the unhealthy liturgies in order to transform idolatry into worship? And I'm thinking of worship in the sense of our entire lives. How are our minds and our bodies living sacrifices? And so I'm going to end there.
Good cop, bad cop. I don't think really, really bad cop, because I don't have a scathing critique. FBI is probably appropriate because it's sort of ill-informed, half accusations without revealing exactly everything behind it. It's probably no. So my intention is to explore the limits of these ideas, especially the idea of soul making or character development as our work. All ideas have limitations, of course. And you'll hear me graciously if you understand me as not as contradicting Fong's thesis, but as giving a warning of the tripwires. So Fong guesses that the current tendencies to regard, and this is a quote, the current tendencies to regard education as the accumulation of knowledge and skills for the workplace would have been greeted by Keats with dismay. And I confess, I've used that straw man to my comfort many times. Straw men are great punching bags. It's a victimless crime, and I indulge in it for some kind of release, especially when I'm in the mood to defend the liberal arts or to criticize the creeping vocational training. But it's another fallacy that I want to point out, and that's equivocation, especially on the word education. Now, Fong doesn't explicitly equivocate, but I did in my mind when I read him the first time, and I have a suspicion he wanted me to in that quote, because it's because he uses education, as I think we all do very often, ambiguously. And I've learned that whenever there's an ambiguity, make a distinction. That's the pill. So the distinction I want to make is between education in its comprehensive sense. You get that when people say, I'm going to college to get an education. Education in its comprehensive sense. And then education in its specific sense. When somebody more I think, insightfully says, I'm going to college to improve my education. No, that's the other way around. When someone says, I'm going to college to improve my education, they're thinking of education comprehensively. When someone says, I'm going to college to get an education, they're talking specifically. But we use the same word, and we sometimes use them without really attending to which sense we mean, and I think maybe he's doing that here. And so accumulating knowledge and skills is in fact education. That's education, but it's education in a specific sense. It's certainly not education in a comprehensive sense. So I'd like to just make that distinction first, because the tripwires come from our mixing up the senses. So what are the limits of us as soul makers? Now, all of this talk of soul making and character development, that's part and parcel of the comprehensive view of education. I think we need to take a giant dose of humility sometimes and remember that we have a small part in the comprehensive education of an individual, of a human being. They come here to get a specific slice of that comprehensive shaping of their character, but the idea that sometimes we can start to feel that we have a bigger role to play than we actually do, I think is a real tripwire of the discussions about, just soul making, just the idea from Keats, of course. And again, I'll say, this Fung Keats thing, take away the pantheism, and I'm right on board. I'm right there. But I have to constantly remind myself that, here, I sort of made myself a little list of the dangers that I want to warn myself of. One of them is a loss of clear purpose. If we take on ourselves, as faculty members, if we take on ourselves a greater role in the formation of human beings than actually is our due, I think we actually, ironically, lose our sense of purpose rather than gain our sense of purpose. We were talking earlier about ideal versus the practical, and this grand idea of shaping the character of a person can actually cause us to lose our sense of the actual purpose. What are the skills that we've gained? What has brought us to this particular thing? Why were we hired in the first place? Might have a much smaller thing, might be a much smaller slice than that grand idea. So we might experience a loss of purpose. We might experience, I think it might cause us to unwittingly participate in what we might call the cult of the academy. The idea that this is an alternative church, that the university is a place where people come to get the real answers. And their Sunday school teacher doesn't have those answers because she isn't educated the way we are. That's a cult. And I think faculty members often are basically priests of a cult. I heard one of my beloved faculty, Reg McClellan, he said one time that, advocating for the role of faculty, he said that faculty are the conscience of the university. And I was thinking, help us. Faculty are the conscience of the university. Let's bring ourselves down a little bit. No, there's, if you sort of attend to the kind of cultish language that goes on in the academy, it gives me the heebie-jeebies sometime, and I just want to remember that we are not the church. We are an arm. We may be a ministry of the church. We may be as individuals. We are part of the church, but the university as an institution is not a replacement for the church. It is certainly not a judge of the church, and I think that bears reminding. So the character formation, the soul making, takes place as really and truly by their Sunday school teachers, who may give them half-truths, and so do we. But they may have the Word of God for them. That's going to shape their destiny far more than we imagine. Another danger might be it feeds into institutional pride, a bad kind of pride, to keep on telling ourselves that we are, just keep on telling ourselves that we mean more to these students than we may actually mean. And ultimately, I think it might lead to despair. It might lead us to despair. If we actually think that we can shape in a grand, significant way our students' being, we might despair. And I think a lot of faculty members do despair. They cling to the one or two examples. We all bring out the one or two examples of the students who remember us years gone by and think we made such an impact. And but we can easily despair over the dozens and dozens who we didn't seem to make a difference at all. Maybe that's actually more the norm, and we can actually have a healthy contentment in our little place. Okay, but there's a temptation to despair. I think it's vain folly to imagine that all depends on us. And I have a tendency toward that all the time. Everything depends on me, this class, this institution. This person's life depends on us. I've got to shape this person. And so, as our tendency, we want to put ourselves in a godlike position when we know so little. When it comes right down to it, we know so little of their past. We know nothing of their future. And to bring it back to an individualism, to a good hearty individualism. Every single human being has such a unique path, so specific to them that only God knows. They have a name written on a stone that only God knows, and we know so little of that, and we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful about what we do. There's a poem that's never made sense to me, but now it's starting to maybe. It's William Carlos Williams, you might know it. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Never made much sense to me until now, when I start to see that maybe I'm the person, I'm the red wheelbarrow, and I'm talking, and I'm thinking, so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's one of my favorites. I don't know why. Along with my other favorite, shake and shake the ketchup bottle, none will come out and then a lot'll. So,
Is that a metaphor for teaching?
But yeah, I'm starting to think that could be mocking. That could be the motto of the Cult of the Academy. That's their hymn. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. The freedom to excel at what we're actually good at. We get some incredible freedom when we can say, God knows so much more about this person, and this individual has thousands upon thousands of thoughts every day of their life, and I get a little tiny picture. And I'm going to do my part, and I'm going to leave it to God's shaping providence, and I'll be part of that shaping providence, but only a small part. There's a freedom there. There's a freedom to reclaim our purpose. I don't say that our purpose, which is why I said I do agree, I don't say that our purpose isn't ultimately part of soul formation, but that we are subsumed in that purpose. We are part of that purpose. We are used of God. We're not in the place of God. There is the blessing of doing our work better. There's the blessing of learning institutional humility. There's a blessing of breaking the cult of the academy and returning to our sort of rightful place under God's work and as a ministry of God. I think it'd be a good place for us. As we do our work, and we do it more specifically, using our skills that we were hired for, I think the soul formation, and I think this article points out, that's what happens. When a literature professor actually just teaches literature in an excellent way, that is the most effective soul formation that they can do. It doesn't happen by them setting aside their work and invading the sphere of God. It just has to do with not putting that work. Yeah, that's all.
Okay. I'm tempted to try to steer the discussion in particular ways, especially based on things that he said, but maybe we should just go whatever direction people hear. Are there thoughts, reflections, criticisms, reactions, etc.? Yeah.
It seems to me that we, in response to a couple of thoughts that you made, John, that our impact is both less and more than we realize. I think we tend to think of our impact on students in a certain way, and we long for certain kinds of impact. But the impact may be invisible to us and to them. They may not be conscious of what they've taken away from us because they don't remember where they got it from anymore. But there was something that happened in the way that they observed somebody interacting with a text, for example. The pattern of thinking that you revealed in the way you analyzed something that they took away and are using now, but could never identify where they got it from. So in that sense, it's kind of more, what you contributed was something more than you're aware of or the student's aware of. But it's different than what we imagine. it is. But I also think that when we're relating to ourselves as developing human beings and growing people, we see our own contribution to that process, and kind of value that. But when we're relating to students, we tend to be thinking more of our contribution to them than of what they bring to it, and kind of like what is necessary for them. I remember an experience when I was a young man, and somebody who had been a leader of me at an earlier period in my life made a comment about something along the lines of how glad he was that he had invested in me because look at how well I turned out. And I was thinking, your impact was pretty minimal. And that has always stuck with me as kind of this revelation of how I perceive myself and my impact on others and how others perceive that. And I think that, anyway, your comments just raised a lot of these thoughts for me, and I think it's very helpful to reflect on this as we think about what our real mission is as professors.
You made this a great presentation to ponder things, and I was thinking about, for Amy and I, my wife and I, the educational process is highly transformative. And I think education process is very transformative. I think what some of you put out is something often maybe don't ponder is to what extent individual teachers contribute to that is a different issue than that whole process. I was remembering when I came in a freshman and had Carolyn Turkson for a class. I got put in honors English because I did a good essay and I did lousy in honors English. I didn't do so hot. But I came from a small mill town school that I had some natural writing, but I had not had the best training. And so whenever almost everybody, even people from small towns like me had English that was ahead of where I was, but I was one of the better students in our high school. But I was thinking about when we came to Lee, it was a distinct arm of the church. And I think that when you talk about this discussion, you talk about Keats and so forth, I think that the cultural shifts and particular institutional morphs has to be factored in. That when we came, we felt like we, at that time, I'm not celebrating it, I'm just reflecting, we thought we were at a Church of God institution. I think that the way we are more diverse and broad now is a great contribution and is a wonderful place. And for the culture of today, this is probably a better institution for today that Lee back then wouldn't work now, probably. But you look at all the people that are a lot of the leaders and people that were here and see how highly committed they are to Lee. And we aren't necessarily seeing those same dynamics developing early on in younger faculty because those folks, a lot of them came here and this was a new way of seeing church. I don't know, I know Dr. Durson could speak to this, but it just, it didn't open our mind not to believe in God or be less committed. It probably heightened it for most of us. And so I think that how we ought to think about what does soul making mean to carry on some of the things people saw happening, and how do we do it to do differently? Because the students have changed; they're not the same students. It's a different culture.
I think it's interesting to talk about this in the context of soul making, but I also deal with a lot of students whose previous experiences in education, schools, and various teachers are soul destroying. And I think that's the other aspect of what we do here. And I think this is something that I would hope would be somewhat unique, although I don't think we are as unique as we think we are sometimes. I came from a very secular background in all ways. And Aaron, you and I have talked about, because we share some common experience in places. But I'm reminded what some people did that impacted me. And I'm not suggesting that God didn't have a plan and take me where he wanted me to be. But, I think some of these people not only gave me the intellectual and academic tools, but they also encouraged me in some remarkable ways. And whether they were believers or not, I think God even used them to accomplish something. You know, I have been attracted to Lee because of what the paradigm was when I got here. I'm really concerned that that paradigm may not just be shifting, because I think every place changes, but I don't want to lose what we do, because I see students every day, and we talk mostly about everything but history and but classes. And I think if you look at society, what you see is, you know, our students and, you know, others who are going to whether college, university, I think we have very poor models. I don't think there's any surprise, for example, or coincidence that we have so many divorces when most of the students that we talk about or that we interact with come perhaps from divorced homes. I mean, how do they know to have a relationship? Kevin, I hate to do this, but I'm going to tell you what, after I read this contribution that Kevin made about cell phones a few years ago, and I watch you people, some of us, in faculty meetings, and I'm thinking, I hate when students are doing this in my classes, but I watch colleagues do this. And you're going to know when I'm leaving, because I'm going to visit some people's offices, and I'm going to grab your cell phone, and I'm going to throw them as far as I can throw them. It doesn't mean that I don't have one. But we also model something beyond just intellectualism and scholarship. So I think we can also participate in a kind of a soul-destroying process, which I think is really serious.
Yeah, texting as well as other social media devices are what Foucault would call technologies of the self. I mean, these are liturgies that are shaping us in ways that we just don't even know.
Yeah.
I have different liturgies now than I did before there was a computer that needed to be opened as soon as I go in my office. It used to be I went in my office and read books and did what I needed to, and et cetera. And now the first thing is to check emails, to do right. And so I have liturgies of distraction now that actually keep me from doing better, I think, what I was hoping to do. Yeah.
I found myself, as the three of you were talking, thinking about Rev Tevye, the old man in Fiddler on the Roof. And he was listening to an argument, and he said to one of the people, "You were right." And he said to the other one, "You were also right." And the bystander said, "They cannot both be right." And he said, "You know, you were also right." He said, "That's all right." I found myself thinking this. Yes, you are right, that we are in the process of soul making, but no, we are not the sole component in that soul making, and that in our emphasis on shaping the soul, we can't lose the importance of shaping the intellect. We can't lose the discipline of what we do in the feeling of wanting to minister to the whole person. But yet, we have to realize that we are a part of shaping the whole person.
John, your time.
Oh, well, Mary has
Sorry,
yours.
Lucy.
I kind of feel like I want to respond to everybody, but I'm not. Go ahead.
Well, I might be repeating what everyone else has already said, so that'll give you a perfect opportunity. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I feel like now I'm like, oh, but I'm just thinking about there's a real tension here, because on one hand we have a huge responsibility, and the huge responsibility is teaching well and showing our passion for what we're teaching and why it's important, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, there's a sense I find myself having endless anxiety over that responsibility at times, and thinking, what if I'm putting something out here that's actually going to be detrimental? So it kind of brings in the question of, on one level, there's a very humbling recognition when I hear my students' stories, when I find out what's impacted them, and how sometimes things that are read and taught in the classroom impact people in far greater ways than I would imagine, and has nothing to do with what I said. It has to do with their experience reading the text and how it intersects with their life and what God does with that. But on the other hand, there's a sense that they're constantly watching me, and they're constantly we are modeling things for them. And so I have a concern over, oftentimes, especially because I teach very modern things, and a lot of things that are bringing up very difficult questions about loss of faith, meaning in life, violence, all these sorts of things, and I have to constantly think, I'm putting this out there, I'm leading them through it. Is there a way that I could be leading them the wrong way? Do you see what I'm saying? So there's a tension in the fact that God is, I've really got to sit back and realize that God is at work and that He's doing far more than what I imagine. But I've also got to realize that I do have a responsibility for the things I choose and how I teach them. And so I guess I'm just saying, it just seems like life in general, that there's a sense of you have a responsibility, but there's also, that's a burden. And maybe the burden can be lifted more somewhat, thinking that it's not all up to you. It's not up to me to know all these student stories, and because I can't. So I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I find it really, you've brought up, all of you have brought up interesting things that just kind of, there's a
It also-
tension.
Well, go ahead.
It also shows, I think, why we need each other as a collective faculty.
Yeah.
All of us had somewhat different reactions to the article. I think most of us have at least close to consensus on how we actually feel about this, but each of us wrote something different. And so it's kind of a privilege, honestly, to see how those things come together and shape each other.
Many of the things that we ought to be doing in the character formation and all these things, I think are actually are indeed our responsibility. But they're our responsibility as Christians in the world, not our responsibility as professors. And there's another distinction to make, that of course, a student, or a person, let's not even call him a student, a human being who is in deep sorrow needs comfort from a human being. And as a Christian, it's a duty to extend the Christian comfort, not as a professor, but as a Christian, and encouraging one another daily and inspiring each other to good works. These are Christian duties, but they're not my duty as a professor. Not that there's no, obviously I'm a Christian professor, and so my duty of selecting materials, that is a great responsibility, but God, I can make wise choices or I can make bad choices, and God can forgive that. when I fail, God can forgive even that. And trusting in God's forgiveness and trusting that this person's life isn't actually my own, I can have contentment. I can have peace that yes, I might fail. God can forgive that. I will strive to improve my pedagogy, but I don't need to bear the anxiety that all depends on me, whether for good or for ill. Because even, students can sometimes remember, I remember bright points, somebody said this, a professor said this, and it stuck with me, but it wasn't because the professor said that, it was because a whole long, inexplicable chain of experiences led me to that moment, hear those words, and they made sense. It's like reading the Proverbs, where you can read the Proverbs all your life, every year, and some Proverbs make no sense until a life experience comes along, and suddenly that proverb is your proverb. It's like a bright light, like those bright lights. That's what I think of the Proverbs. And a little light bulb comes on, which you've read a dozen times before. Well, professors say something, and just because God has shaped that person through many experiences, many words, and then suddenly a professor says something that they've said 1,000 times before, but for that person, that made sense. Well, that's what we do, but I don't think we have to bear the anxiety that somehow, because of that moment, I either changed their life or I ruined their life. No, we struggle to do our best. We strive before God to fulfill our work. And then as Christians with one another and with other human beings, we certainly fulfill the duties of our Christian life.
I think that's the other side of your red wheelbarrow, though. It might be the linchpin of the universe.
John, what I was going to say, I loved everything all three of you had to contribute to in an effort tie this to the QEP. Lord help me. John made the point, can't be overstated, that for us to do what we do and to do it well, to do it very well. And when I think about us in the classroom, back to what Dr. Kahn said yesterday, I'll get to the QEP. What's his job? He says to put students in the presence of great faculty. Well, let's carry that one step further. What's our job? To put material in front of students in such a way that they engage with it in a meaningful way, and that God uses it such as He will. And so I think the word we've all, one phrase, experience, that keeps coming to the top, is God uses different experiences. So as teachers, for us to do what we do well, what kind of really powerful moments or opportunities or experiences are we giving our students to engage with the material in a meaningful, powerful, memorable way? That's sort of a shared duty. It rests on us to be creative, to be intentional, to be just think out of the box. Because in that moment, it's not necessarily about what we say. I think in terms of music, this is very easy for us. It's the music I select, but how that's going to speak to a student is all across the board. But if I can create that moment, if we can work towards that moment where everything is done so well and that music performance is as best as it could be, it speaks to everybody in so many different ways. And I think that can happen, I'd like to think, in other classrooms. Another thought, this idea of modeling, and kind of a biblical worldview. I mean, we are God's image bearers, so it is to take the pressure off of us, not as a professor, as John was saying, but as a Christian, as we are modeling. We are, as teachers, I'd like to think we are hopefully just showing our students a clearer picture of who God is, and that might spark a better picture, a clearer picture of the divine. We're not going to do that perfectly, but God is merciful. That rubbed off on us, we can show mercy. God is faithful. That rubbed off on us, we can show faith. God is gracious, we can show grace. And on and on and on. His character is within us, and so how clearly are we modeling that in the classroom? I think that is what's really important. Another random thought I had, sometimes I feel like when I think of shaping our students, if they leave here, and we do have a hand in this, and they identify themselves more as a graduate of the Lee than they do as a Christian, we have done them a disservice. They first must have to leave here, and their primary identity, hopefully as a believer, if they are a believer, is that of a Christian. But if they are more committed to lead than they are to Christ when they leave this place, we have failed them.
We need to wrap up quickly, right? To give 5 minutes or so for the other people. Let me just say that one of the things that came out when we were having a conversation earlier this week was when we were hired here, we were just experts in our field, not experts in Christianity, and yet we were highly tempted by all the possibilities that a Christian university raises of being a model, being a mentor, discipling, teaching as discipleship, etc. Which is where suddenly that's an abyss one falls into, and suddenly you're trying to do everything. And this is what John was trying to say. We've got to step back from that. We can't play God in the process of soul making. And the metaphor that I thought of is that if all of us are the pots being on the potter's wheel, sometimes we think that we have to shape the pot, and we don't realize that in fact we're one of 1,000 little fingers that God is using as this pot is spinning around on the wheel. So on the one hand, yes, it's left. Let's rein ourselves back in. On the other hand, if I'm bringing my Christianity to bear on every single thing I do, then suddenly everything matters. I mean, you can't say I don't matter. Act of humility, self-emptying, etc. And then on the other hand, everything matters. And this is exactly I think what Mary was getting at. I think we are just caught in the tension. I have no answers to it. I mean, if a university is a cluster of these liturgies, it has to be more than what goes on in the classroom, because the students were being shaped when they came in, while they were there not paying attention to us, or while they were paying attention to us, and when they left. So in that sense, then suddenly everything matters. And I think faculty have we would like to point our fingers at residents' life and say, well, that if they were doing that thing better, if the administration would stop so-and-so from, running them up. But in fact, I've just noticed how just very little things, the directions I walk, or the places I'm walking at particular times of the day, like before chapel or at lunchtime, actually end up having the eternal significance and sparks of divinity or flying off of somebody's, hammer. So anyway, can I just leave it in the, you get the last word.
No, I don't want the last word, you can say
No,
the
it's
last
too
word.
late.
So
He gets the
I'm
last
trying to
word.
jump in. Well, it just reminds, this tension is exactly right, it reminds me of the tension of sovereignty, responsibility. And the Scottish teacher in Rabbi Duncan, he used to put it this way, that in an arch, right hand pressure, the right hand stones say right hand pressure is good, and the left hand stones say left hand pressure is good, and it's only by them both exerting the force at the same time that the keystone is held up. And we can use this tension to our advantage whenever we are tempted to despair, whenever we are tempted to be anxious about our role. We can remind ourselves that I fill a small space and this is God's work in this life. But whenever we are tempted to be apathetic, whenever we are tempted to just relax and when our work gets sloppy, we can remember we have a grave responsibility to fulfill, both as a Christian duty. And by holding those two things in tension, I think that's the only way we can sort of keep that keystone in place, maybe.
That's a good lesson.
I liked it.
All right.